Thank you very much. We now have a panel that follows on wonderfully, I hope, from those remarks on real-time use of real-time data in space. Could I ask the panelists, most of whom are called Dan, to come up onto the stage, please? And one of our panelists will be joining us from elsewhere. That'll be Lieutenant. There we are, General Shaw. Nice to meet you.
Hey, good afternoon.
So I think we're here in this panel to talk about some of those ideas that Lynn and Susan just set up for us very nicely, and to talk about how to reach the sort of like proper balance between competition and coordination and cooperation. And I'm going to try and lead that discussion, but I'm obviously going to leave it up to you to really have it. But before we do that, maybe I could just go along the panel and ask you all just to introduce yourselves and say who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I'm Robert Conrad. I'm with Kepler Communications US. I head up business development and growth for our US entity here in the United States.
Dan Tenney. I am the Vice President of Strategy and Business Development for Lockheed Martin. Spent 27 years with NASA, and so Robert and I were passing war stories early on. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
I'm with LeoLabs. I'm Dan Ceperley. I'm the CEO and founder, and at LeoLabs, we track all of the activities going on in low Earth orbit for space traffic management, space domain awareness, and the like.
And General Shaw, I never know where to look on these things.
Oh, hey, good afternoon. John Shaw here. I'm the Deputy Commander of the United States Space Command with our headquarters here in Colorado Springs. And wish I could have been there with you in person, but we're kind of busy right now, as you can imagine. So I'm glad I could at least dial in remotely.
Okay. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. And maybe start with you, Dan. Further, Dan. Tell us a little bit about how the world has evolved in terms of real-time data about space operations in the last few years.
Absolutely. We've been going through a dramatic period of change, has been highlighted all day. The number of satellites operating in low Earth orbit has grown about tenfold in the last 4 years, from 800 satellites operating in LEO in 2019 to about 8,000 right now. And so the theme across the industry is scaling and urgency. And so a big part of what we've done during that time is to roll out a network of radars located on the ground around the world to keep up with all this traffic. And the goal is to basically make a commercial version of the map for space that can be used for transparency, safety of flight, and also to avoid strategic surprise, and basically to complement and extend all the great work that's been done by U.S. Space Force, U.S. Space Command, and allied space agencies over the years to put kind of a commercial element to it.
And when you talk about this immense increase in number of low Earth orbit satellites, would I be right in saying it would have been a pretty immense increase even if it hadn't been for SpaceX, if it hadn't been for Starlink?
Oh, yes. Well, and we were joined by some people actually putting up other satellites into space, but absolutely. So SpaceX gets a lot of headlines. They've been doing a lot of great work, but there are other mega constellations. There's other medium-sized constellations pursuing all sorts of different applications. Internet is certainly one of them, but also safety services for tracking airlines, tracking ships, tracking logistics. Agriculture is a big theme. It's amazing how the space industry has just plugged in to the terrestrial industry all around the globe, and is now just one of the important tools in the toolkit for business, especially if you're doing business globally.
So, Dan Tenney, I'm intrigued that, it used to be that we used to think about sending things out into space as sending things out into a great emptiness. How different is it now that you're sending things out into a place not only which has other stuff in it, but where you can actually get real-time, semi-real-time data about where that stuff is? How does that change the way you think about missions?
Yeah, it drastically changes how we think about things. So I think we are quickly moving into an age where it's less about the platform and more about the interconnectivity that we see. So it's all about getting the right data to the right people at the right time, and there's a lot of rights in there that have to occur. But whether it's for us in civil purposes, I mean, think weather and disasters such as that, or it's adversarial purposes. I mean, if you think about a time of crisis or conflict, we have to make sure that our data is resilient, and we have to make sure it's assured to the warfighter. And so that involves us thinking about multiple orbit regimes, multiple domains, and interconnectivity. And that's where I see us really heading. I mean, we're doing a tremendous amount of work in how we connect systems so that we can make that data as relevant as possible to our military and to our civil populations to protect global citizens. That's what it's really about. So I think space has moved from just developing a platform that does a particular type of capability to interconnecting data that does multiple capabilities.
General Shaw, I'd like to come to you on that. Historically, the military uses the military's kit, and you procure stuff, you train on it, you use it. How different does that have to be for Space Force when there is so much civilian capacity in the realms that you're dealing with?
Well, I think we've come a long way, and we actually, from a national security perspective, we rely on commercial capabilities today. And we will do so for the foreseeable future. In fact, we're relying on capabilities provided by all the companies represented by your panel there today, from communications in orbit to space domain awareness and commercial capabilities that we rely on to complement our more traditional national security capabilities. And we need them, and we need that capability set and that bandwidth, and we're not going back. So we're intertwined.
And how does that work operationally? I mean, are there ways in which you can sort of like commandeer things when needed, or is it all as though you were another commercial customer? What's the situation?
Well, right now the relationships are contractual mostly, and how we get those services. There's continued discussion as we enter the new dynamics of the security environment space, which is exactly what we're talking about today. About how would that service continue in time of war or when capabilities come under threat. For this panel, I had suggested the tagline, and I think it made it onto the website, that you may not be interested in space security, but space security is interested in you. Paraphrasing Leon Trotsky just a little bit, if you want to look up what he said about a century ago about war. But you've already hit on it, right? And security is not just about intentional threats from adversaries in time of war. It's about all the hazards that we'll face in the domain as it gets more and more congested and crowded, and there's more actors doing it. So the panel's already talked about something. Some of them are just our natural hazards of debris in space. Others are just how do we navigate and what are the rules of the road for any actor operating in space with all the other actors. And then what do we do when actual threats emerge, whether it's mischief, jamming, or no kidding war that extends into space. This is going to be a spectrum of security instances that we're all going to need to focus on and be aware of and be part of the solution. Hey, I'll leave that thought by saying I liked what Sue said on the last panel ending that says she's an optimist. Despite everything I just said there about space security challenges, I'm an optimist. I actually think it means space has arrived as a human domain, right? We have those security challenges in every other domain, the maritime domain, the land domain. It's natural that those would now occur in the space domain as it has now become so vital to human society.
I always think there's something lovely about that phrase which I think is in our material for this panel. There's some interesting tension between the degree to which it's comforting, that it's interested in us, and it's slightly disturbing that it's interested in us as well. I think that beautifully captures something. So,
hey, Oliver, can I suggest that is human?
So, Robert, you're actually involved in making sure that this all hangs together in terms of getting the data to the people who want it, not just in the ground, but to the objects that want it in space. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Oliver. I mean, the mission for Kepler is really to bring internet to space. And what that really means, pulling on what you said, Dan, is really connectivity. Here on Earth, we have iPhones, we have our computers. We're instantly connected to anything that we need. The information is readily available to us, and over the next decade, I think what we're going to see, and Kepler is going to be a part of this, is how do we connect all of these orbiting assets and platforms, whether they're Earth observation satellites, or we heard about Voyager Space and their human spaceflight habitats, the stuff going to Artemis, going to the moon. How do we connect all of these assets in near real time and provide data to the end users, whoever they are? And that connectivity goes both ways, both from Earth to space and space back to Earth. And that's where we're transitioning to. And the other thing here I'd like to add about resiliency, I think, is we see these constellations going up both on the government side and the commercial side, having resiliency built in so that we as a nation have a backup, if you will, in case bad things happen, right? We have other avenues to connect data to the warfighter and other mission users that may need that critical data.
Does it make a difference to the sort of data systems that you need, that we're anticipating seeing a lot more, some real commercial human spaceflight?
I think it does. There's different applications, but there has to be collaboration and a focus, I think, from the government and the commercial side to really look at compatibility. General Shaw brought up, the contractual relationship that the government can have with commercial industry, but the government has done a very good job over the last decade in these private-public partnerships, which are Space Act agreements and CRADAs and other BAAs and other types of vehicles that allow this collaboration between the U.S. government and the commercial sector like us, which I think is quite valuable.
Tenney, I want to ask you the other thing. So more humans is one thing. The other thing is we're now looking at an era where there's going to be more in terms of proximity operations. Is that something that you're involved in? Is that something that you're thinking about?
Yeah, for sure. And General Shaw said something that reminded me of, I'll just touch on for a second, I'll come right back to it. When you think about humans, you think about the history of humans, it always starts with exploration, right? So you explore, you think of the explorers on land, you think of explorers on the sea. They just want to understand what's out there. When they find something, commercial industry now comes in, economy comes in. And then once we know that something is worth, it's valuable, you have to protect it. And so when you think about the space domain and where we are, we have vital assets, as General Shaw said, to our daily lives. We were talking on a panel recently, and you all will get this. We were talking about the global positioning system. So position, navigation, timing is critical to everyday life, right? We get directions on our phone, when we drive in our car, we do banking transactions and other things that are controlled by the atomic clocks that are on the GPS. And there was a person in the audience that raised their hand and said, "Why do I need GPS satellites? I have directions on my phone." Right? We were kind of like, well, come see me after the talk and we'll talk further about that. But that's the way we think about space today. It's in our daily lives, whether it's in the civilian world or the military world. And when we think about proximity, there are also adversarial capabilities out there. It's no secret of what we see from our adversaries out there and some of the things that they're doing. And so we have to protect that domain. And as General Shaw said, the very same thing we face in the air domain and the sea domain and the land domain, we're facing in space. And so we have to protect our assets through multiple ways. And Robert, you talked on resilience. I think that you said something I think is really important, that we have to be resilient by design. And so that can involve, anti-jamming and other effectors. It can involve redundant capabilities. It can involve capabilities that are multiple orbits. There's lots of ways that we can do that. Or nested constellations that create swarms and other things. But that's where we are. That we have to think of space entirely different to make sure that we have assurance that the assets that we have up there that we live with in our daily lives and to protect our military and global citizens remain there.
Do you have? Yeah.
I was going to just add to the comment about proximity operations. That's something we're seeing an increasing number of. It used to be a proximity operation, 2 satellites flying close together was rare. and it took immense budgets and many years to build the systems that could do it. They're now being launched regularly. There are CubeSat missions out of universities conducting proximity operations. We've certainly seen a number of proximity operations in our operations by China and Russia over the last few years, and actually 3 separate ones with China ongoing right now. And there's a commercial active debris removal industry in development. Go up and grab a piece of debris, and those companies are getting quite sophisticated. So part of looking up at space, it used to be you look up and you saw the void, and now you're seeing a lot of activity. Well, it also used to be you look up and satellites wouldn't maneuver very often; they're just coasting around the Earth. Now they're really dynamic. So space, not only is there a lot more traffic, those satellites are a lot more agile, and there's just a lot more of them.
And they need to be able to, as it were, talk. I mean, Chad was making a really interesting point in the first of our Fireside Chats about machine-to-machine communication. That made me wonder, for all of you, is this a case? This is actually one of my. I love military initializations everywhere, but I particularly love hittle, hottle, hootle, which is humans in the loop, humans on the loop, or humans out of the loop. Hittle, hottle, hootle. You heard it here. Which way are we going? Do we need to have humans in the loop on this? Do we need to get them out of the loop on this? Where do humans sit in your system, in the Vertex system that LeoLabs does?
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing our part of the industry rapidly go to full automation. And I'd say one of the customers that's in the extreme is SpaceX with their Starlink constellation, the sheer number of satellites they're flying. So we're spending every day shoveling over millions of conjunction data messages. All the kind of close approaches, hey, you got to be careful of, you're going to come close to another piece of debris.
So millions of messages a day?
Millions of messages. And it's the general awareness of everything flying around them. Then their system throws back at us. Here's the ones we think are high priority. Here's how we potentially steer around the debris. We check those plans and ship the updated alerts back to them. It's all machine to machine. That's what actually enables the scale that we're talking about. If you had people in the loop, you'd be limited to a small number of satellites, 10 satellites, 20 satellites, and the like. But now we're talking hundreds, we're talking thousands, soon tens of thousands of satellites. It has to be fully automated.
Oliver, I think it's both, right? So we did a lot of testing recently with drones, and then we put it in space. And it was really about how do you have them talk to each other? So have these capabilities that can speak to each other, understand where you are, what mission you're doing, and let the computer then task. And what I mean by that is, so let's say you have a satellite constellation and a satellite goes down, and it's doing communications or ISR or whatever have you. Can we autonomously pass that to have another satellite take its place? So it's almost a self-healing concept. So we've demonstrated that. That's really important. It happens, instantly, just as you're describing, Dan. I think on the other hand, if you're talking about the warfighter and whether we're going to make critical decisions on attacks or things like that for defense purposes, we have to have a human in the loop. I mean, ultimately, we don't want to say necessarily, General Shaw can speak about this better than I can, but thinking about, I think it's both of how can we use AI and machine learning to advance many capabilities, but I also think there's a human in the loop that's needed for many other things that are critical to national security.
You preempt my chair's privilege. I was just going to ask General Shaw, at what stage do you need humans in the loop? What's the sort of like area where you transfer from millions of machine messages up to having people looking and making decisions?
Hey, Oliver, I'll be a little bit of a troublemaker, and I'll turn the question back and say, well, where's that same inflection point in the air domain when it comes to air operations, or maybe even as we see more and more autonomous machines in the maritime domain, where is that point? I think we'll know when we see it, when there is the application of force for national security purposes that needs humans. But I agree with everything both Dan said. Dan Tenney was absolutely right when he said we need both, and Dan Ceperley was absolutely right when he says our technology is to the point now where we can't ignore automation or autonomous capabilities or machine learning or ultimately incorporating artificial intelligence. It has to be part of a much broader infrastructure and finding the right balance point. Here's another way to look at it. As our national security space operations get further and further away from the planet, the speed of light starts to become an issue. And there's only three ways to fix that, right? The first is we bring humans closer to wherever that activity is happening, where the speed of light was mattering, we're reaching back to Earth. The second is we have machines operating autonomously and machine learning, and they are doing that themselves. And the third solution is just to do something about the speed of light communication. We might need to just solve that physics problem. Aside from those three solutions, it's going to be one of those three or mixture.
I'm very glad that you bring up the last one, because I wouldn't like to think the Space Force isn't thinking about Ansibles and warp drives, because that's really what we want from you. But Rob, I wanted to ask you about. I want to ask you about this question of how much humans are part of this and how much the space realm becomes a machine-to-machine world. Does that change decisions you make about the way that you develop the architectures for Kepler?
I think it will, yeah. I like Dan here, I think there's a hybrid approach depending on the application, but providing data connectivity and near real-time data and pulling on the thread of space situational awareness. As that technology increases and we're looking at assets in space with space-based sensors, and all that data comes down to the warfighter to make a decision. Who is that decision made autonomously, or is that decision made not just by the DoD, but probably, it's a political decision as well in a lot of cases, right? But I think irrelevant of that, it's important for us to be able to deliver the data to the end user. And then, like General Shaw said, as we work through this, we'll make decisions of what we can automate and what really makes no sense at the time to automate.
When we're looking again at to keep on this question of resiliency, does automation help with resiliency, or does automation build you into something where you can't actually respond so well? And leaving aside the obvious question, well, if you do it right, it does that. But what are the concerns you have about doing it right, about making an automation that leaves you resiliency rather than one which might engineer that out of the system?
Any of us? Oliver, you want to?
I'll go for you because you, like Rick earlier, you made the mistake of nodding and looking wise. So,
I did. You were looking in my eyes. I figured. So, yeah, I think it helps it for sure. I mean, as I gave the analogy earlier about having spacecraft talk to one another and understanding where you are in the domain, what that spacecraft is doing, what the condition of it is, et cetera. And so if you can automate that, you can create this concept of self-healing. You can also, the other thing that's coming about, and I think is going to really move us in the next decade, is on-edge processing. Right? Being able to process in space, transmit data directly down. At what point do we say ground systems are no longer effectively needed? You may get to that point. Our capabilities get so good with machine learning and automation and passing data around. Today when you go on the internet, you don't know what server you're on. You just know data's moving across the world instantaneously. And Robert, you were talking about this earlier. The idea to have data moving around creates resiliency in itself. Because if you don't know where it's being transmitted, the uplinks, et cetera, you're in fact creating a resilient form. Swarms of networks also create resilient forms. So AI and machine learning, I think, are critical to our future of creating resilience.
Yeah, I'd add for resilience that the cost of the systems is quite critical too. And one of the major things we've seen sweeping through the space industry is the cost coming down to the point where you can put up huge numbers of satellites. You can get these proliferated constellations in LEO. You can have so many satellites that you can lose a few satellites, the system still works. You can have spares on orbit and the like. And we're seeing the same thing on the ground side. So we like to talk about the radar network that we build as a proliferated network of radars, but for the ground. Take that model that's started in space and pull it down on the ground, so that, again, you've got radars around the world. You can take one down for maintenance or upgrades or the like, and the system can still continue on. And also, by increasing the numbers, you can look at satellites all around the globe. You can catch them, when they're maneuvering over the southern hemisphere, which has traditionally not been well covered in space domain awareness. You can find satellites immediately after launch rather than days or weeks later. And a lot of that comes around from moving away from the massive, exquisite radars, the kind of big installations that have been built in the past, over to much smaller units.
So how many units do you now have?
10 radars working at 6 sites around the world.
And where does that go up to?
So our goal is to go to more than 20 sites over the next few years, with the idea that the number of satellites is increasing, and the number of launches is increasing, and the number of launch sites is increasing. So simply, in order to be able to catch an event as quickly as possible, you need eyes on the sky as close to it as possible. And so that means radars nearby. And that wasn't really in the trade space for many years, this notion that a space tracking radar could be built quickly or built at a reasonable price point. For us, it was a few decades of work by my co-founders with the National Science Foundation in the US, studying the aurora borealis, studying the northern lights. They got really good at building radars above the Arctic Circle. And if you're studying the ionosphere, the northern lights, you inadvertently track satellites. And so they had piles of data that they were throwing away, and when I met them, it was the aha moment of, oh wow, your trash is really what's needed for space traffic management. So that's how we got the start with the technology.
So for those of you who are keeping score, this really is actually the Economist Space Economy and Arctic Links conference.
Oliver, I'd like to talk a little bit about edge processing,
Yeah.
if I may, just so the audience understands what we're talking about here. But if you take, as an example, if you took an Earth observation satellite that had an optical instrument taking images of the Earth, and they take so many images of a day, they have contracts to take images of certain locations, and that data comes back down to the ground that is processed. Some of those images, there's cloud cover, and the images really have no value to the end user. So all of this data that's being transmitted back to the Earth, there's a fair percentage of it that's really not valuable to the end user. But if you can take that processing capability and put it on orbit, now you can reduce that amount of the volume of data that's needed, right? Reducing the capacity, and that's kind of, it's automation, it's machine learning of saying, hey, we're making decisions, hey, we've took 50 images, but only 32 of them are valuable, right? And that's all, the rest of it goes away. So that's what we really mean by edge processing and moving these decisions that are made here on Earth as the technology increases, moving that up into space.
Does that mean that you think that Earth space bandwidth is going to be the long-term constraint? Because I was amazed, so thinking about those lovely little Dove satellites that Will Marshall and his colleagues make, they're each of them doing about a gigabit a second, which I think for something the size of a shoebox is pretty good. Do you think there's going to be so much data that we're going to want to get down to the Earth that actual downlink will be a major bottleneck?
Yeah, I think even today, you see with a lot of the data that needs to get to the Earth, there's a bottleneck with ground stations today. And so companies like Kepler are trying to build a space relay network to allow more near real-time data, but still, we have to get data down to the ground. So that's truly the bottleneck. Mm-hmm. And the way to do that is to have multiple feeder links, or as you see these optical intersatellite links come on board, there's a lot of money being poured in by the government and commercial industry to really look at optical space to ground. NASA's certainly very big into this, right, to really open up that bandwidth.
Okay, we're going to get a bit more nerdy about this, because I've been hearing about optical satellite interlinks since I first met Rick Tomlinson, not that he actually told me about them, and when I first met Bob Zubrin. These things have been talked about for ages. Why are they not now a routine part of my life?
Well, I think the technology has increased significantly over the last 5 or 10 years, and I think having General Shaw maybe talk about
yes.
about the proliferated warfighter space architecture that SDA is developing would probably be a good point right now.
Yeah, no, take it away, General Shaw.
Well, so Oliver, it's already part of your life, by the way. You're using fiber optics in the land in terrestrial domain, right? For all of your data. That's not how we started with communications in the terrestrial domains, but it's the cutting edge now. And so, yes, you will see more and more optical networks in the space domain as we move forward. Those will be part of not only national security comm architectures, but commercial architectures. The data rates are better. They're a little bit more resilient links. It's just a technology that is going to continue to evolve. So that was the specific question. We're absolutely headed that way. Hey, let me generalize something though that Robert was talking about. It's more of a proposal. What you're seeing with edge processing in the domain itself now is just one manifestation of a growing broader logistics infrastructure in the space domain, right? We're not going to be happy anymore with just pulling raw resources out of the space domain. We're gonna do some manufacturing in the domain. We're gonna do some resupplying in the domain. Edge processing is sort of a digital manufacturing process, but there's going to be a lot more capability a lot more activity that will happen in the domain, in the commercial and the civil and national security sectors than we have traditionally done. And so I just point that out as that's just one salient example of what I see as inevitable is a broader and very capable logistics infrastructure in the domain.
And how does this fit in with the proliferated architecture that Rob was urging you to talk about?
Well, I think Robert, I think what you wanted me to talk about was the resilience, the inherent resilience of a proliferated comm architecture. And that is, so it's not only a more effective comm in many ways, but it also can be more resilient. It's no surprise and no secret that Russia has not been very happy with Ukraine's use of Starlink and that proliferated low Earth orbit constellation. And they've actually made public statements about saying, even commercial capabilities could be targeted because they're being used as part of a national security effort. But turns out it's a lot harder to jam Starlink than it might be to jam a more traditional geosynchronous radio wave communication. And so it has inherent resilient properties that we will certainly be leveraging across all the sectors in the days to come.
Is there a second order advantage there also that it's harder to jam Starlink? It's also harder to disrupt it physically, kinetically with an ASAT. Does resilience to some extent have the advantage of decreasing the value of ASAT operations?
I think you hit my answer. If you look at the cost benefit curves of trying to kinetically or physically interrupt proliferate low Earth orbit satellites, the cost benefit curves are now much against the aggressor, whereas a more traditional large satellite at geosynchronous orbit is a little bit more attractive target, one might say, from a physical perspective. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes. The cost benefit curves change dramatically with proliferated architectures.
And does that also apply in time or even already in GEO if you have, say, some sort of like large staring infrared array in GEO that's looking for little points of hotness? Do you want to distribute that capability too to keep it safe?
Well, I think it'll be a balance between what gets the mission done and also what is a resilient architecture. I would, it didn't have to be that way, Oliver. We could have, we could have built our geosynchronous architectures to be smaller satellites and distributed a little bit more. So why are they the way they are today? Why are they these very, very large satellites that do an awful lot of throughput, but are kind of singular nodes there in space? And I think the answer is because they were cost effective that way. It's the same reason you have super tankers and mega container ships in the maritime domain for shipping today. You don't have a lot of little freighters, you have large, because they are cost efficient and effective, at least for that particular mission set at GEO. But they're not necessarily resilient. I'm not sure I want to be on the bridge of a mega container ship trying to dodge torpedoes. And so we sort of have to start to look at it from a security perspective, and how do we have more resilient architectures? And then there will also be economic drivers for different kinds of architectures, like we're seeing with proliferated LEO today. So be prepared for lots of things to change, and lots of assumptions on how we did business in the past are going to change across all the sectors.
Dan, Tenney, Lockheed has built its fair share of, I guess, what we're now calling satellite supertankers in the past. How much of this is a challenge for the way you do things, so this much more distributed sort of architecture?
Yeah, so, I think distributed architecture's proliferation is certainly a form of resilience, but it's not the only one. There are other effectors and anti-jamming capabilities onboard and offboard satellites that also offer resilience. There's the ability to upgrade a satellite. So, you may have seen in the press about our Aspen port. It's a port on a satellite where we can dock with it, put new payloads on it, update payloads on it. That's another form of resilience. Mm-hmm. If we understand space domain awareness about what's around us, what my friend to the left here, Dan, was talking about things maneuvering. If we can watch that and see it, there are things we can do to prevent that. So I think General Shaw nailed it. They have different purposes, right? So GEO is complicated. You take a lot more power in GEO. It's a whole heck of a lot harder to get into GEO. And then we talk about MEO. There's different dynamics there. There's different radiation concerns and all of those different orbits. So they're all different, and they all require, we can't just take what we've done in LEO and think, let's proliferate MEO and GEO. It's different. The orbit, the speeds are very different. Mm-hmm. When you get into GEO, you kind of track the Earth, mm-hmm. the way you're moving. LEO satellites move very, very fast. And so, the trade-off is it takes a lot of satellites in low Earth orbit to cover the Earth. It takes very few in GEO to cover mm-hmm. the Earth. And so General Shaw's right, there's economic considerations here. But what I would leave you with is there's multiple forms of resilience. And so when we work with our customers like General Shaw, those are discussions we're interested in having with them of how we protect and provide assured capabilities in space. And there's multiple ways to do that.
Yeah.
If I could maybe go back a few steps to an interesting kind of offshoot of the edge computing comment that Robert brought up. There's a huge question kind of with these growing architectures. Where do you centralize all the data? Because we're collecting more and more data. There's Earth observing satellites, fleets of them in space. For us, there's radars located around the world. But you want to collect it in one location in order to analyze it, in order to look for those important changes. And for us, it's things like the newly launched satellites. Satellites are now launched in packs of 40, packs of 60, packs of 100. Are all of them what they're declared to be? Is there something secret, hidden in there? Are they all acting appropriately? Are they all functioning well, or do you need to troubleshoot some anomalous satellites? And then during day-to-day operations, what is the behavior of all the satellites, and what's the one that's acting screwy? It used to be the one among 800, now it's the one among 8,000 satellites, and soon the one among 10,000. And so for us, the application of new AI/ML techniques is quite important, because you've got this data set going back years showing what are the various behaviors of every single satellite up there, how are those linked up to collision avoidance maneuvers, how are those linked up to station keeping or deorbit, or what portion of those are unexplained. And so the AI algorithms are actually having a huge impact on our side of the business. They've been talked about for years. If only we could get to this point where we could throw these systems at it, they would help us find that needle in the haystack. Well, we've reached it, but they're primarily applicable because we can get all the data into the cloud. We work in one of the main cloud vendors. And so rather than having like individual radar sites around the world that are islands, we now have kind of one radar system that spans the globe. And we've got a centralized location that's able to sift through all the data and then task each radar to go check up on interesting things. I would imagine the same thing is going to be true of satellites. But then the big question will be, can you do a lot of that processing in space? Can you centralize all the data, do processing in 1 or 2 or 3 nodes in space? Or do you need to get it all down to the ground, analyze it, and then send information back up? So being firmly rooted on the ground, we've got the benefit of just, we hop on the terrestrial fiber networks and kind of get the data anywhere instantly.
Exactly.
Well, when I heard Pippa this morning was talking about solar power satellites, which I think we've all heard talked about before, it does strike me that it's easier to take solar power in space, turn it into information through using space for data processing and bring that down. Rob, would you see that as the long-term goal for Kepler, to be bringing down data from actual data centers in space?
Yeah, we are actually engaged with a couple of companies that are looking at orbital data centers. So yeah, it is something that is being considered now. There are architectures starting to be developed, and of course, you know, how do we get this data to the end users? How do we store the data? And so yes, I think this is something that's going to be over the next decade. You're going to see this coming online.
And would those be large objects, or would that be, again, is that another thing where you distribute and you basically have distributed orbital data centers?
Well, you could have distributed orbital data centers, but if you look at just from the pure physics and the size of the platform, a lot of the commercial human spaceflight habitat platforms that will be going up are very well suited to start that process, right, of having, I call it a small scale size orbital data center, but it's a platform for growth, right? To prove the technology, to leverage to something where, you know, an Amazon or Microsoft would certainly plan of something that would be much, much larger.
It's very entertaining that I mean, Amazon obviously having sort of like invented cloud computing, sort of like in the process of doing something else. It's to me quite entertaining that Amazon is now in orbit and Blue Origin isn't. It's maybe some strange sibling rivalry. But going back to the question of resilience, and I want to come back to General Shaw, there's also the question of rapid resupply, of replacing that which is lost rather than working around it. In your thinking, is that a form of resilience, or is that something that you to deem extraordinary that happens when resilience has failed?
I think, Oliver, I would say it's actually, I would go back to what I said earlier, it's actually a form of a more robust logistics infrastructure, right? Our ability to replenish capabilities on orbit. And by the way, that can be physically, or it can be, I think it was Dan Tenney that mentioned it earlier, that can just be reprogram, right? It can be uploading new software. That's a form of logistics moving forward. And so so that resupply might happen from other capabilities already on orbit. It may happen from the surface of the Earth, in which case it's responsive from that in that regard. But either way, you're going to see more robust logistics capabilities in space that are leveraged by everybody in space, and that, in a sense, does deliver you resilience. You're less dependent on a more isolated supply chain or supply route that may take months or even years to replace. It's now going to be a much greater tempo and coming from a larger number of sources. But again, that's like any logistics enterprise that we see in the terrestrial domains.
Okay, I'm going to ask about a quick fire question, which all of you go, and I think I'll start with General Shaw. But if we come back here, and I hope we shall, I hope you all will, in 2033, how many satellites in orbit, operational satellites in orbit, will the world be seeing?
I think the question is probably not going to be relevant. It'd be asking like, how many airborne craft are there on the planet today? You know, we might have been able to answer that 100 years ago, but you can't answer that anymore.
No, but if you want a really wonderful cocktail party fact, I should point out that there are more people in the air right now than for most of human history there were on the surface of the planet. The population in airplanes at the moment is considerably larger than the Stone Age population of the planet. So that's just free general information. But so you're not willing to tell me how many satellites do you think there'll be in 2033?
Well, there'll be thousands and thousands. But again, I think it won't be a really relevant question. You'll want to ask about how are we managing the domain, right? We asked that today with drones and air traffic control. It's a continual question that we ask. We'll be continuing to ask that as more and more actors of all conceivable kinds are operating in the broader Earth-Moon system. So I can't wait. Notice I said the moon, right? So we hadn't talked too much about that. When is lunar space domain awareness going to become something that we're interested in because we have enough humans in that environment? Can't wait until Dan Ceperley puts his first radar on the lunar surface.
Well, I was actually going to come back, but you anticipate. But I want to ask these other guys whose business plans have slightly more to do with the actual numbers.
I just hope there's a good prize if I win in
2033. I will definitely buy you an excellent cocktail.
All right. So I'm going to say $250,000.
$250,000.
I'm going to say, we're about to hit the 10,000 satellite mark, and that probably happens this year. And I'm going to say, give it another decade, we should easily hit the 100,000 satellite mark and go beyond it.
Other Dan.
Nowhere close to $250,000. I think you might see double, and here's what I think is going to happen. I think General Shaw's right. We are going to see them go further out. Cislunar comms we're already engaged in, but I want to go back to what he talked about. We're going to see the domain. We're going to see space infrastructure. I mean, we're working on a lot of things today that are around power, mobility in space. And what if one day we can get rid of solar rays? And every time you go by the moon, we just power up your spacecraft. What if we could have small, nuclear things out there that create power, unlimited power in space? We can repair things in space. So eventually, I think we're going to get to a point where orbital debris is a problem. We'll think of space, green space. How do we reuse satellites? Can we take materials off satellites that are out there no longer working and build a new one in space? So I think we won't continue as much proliferation as we think. I think proliferation will continue, but I think we'll also get much more reusability and we'll become more efficient in our use of there because of the space infrastructure itself.
And you're a waster, and Dan is husbanding resources.
Sorry.
Team Dan is disagreeing, but that's good. That's healthy.
You wouldn't want us to totally agree, right? It would be fun.
I'm going to be somewhere in between these two fine gentlemen here. But yes, yeah. So I looked at some statistics the other day, and Dan talked about this earlier when we first started. So in 2017, we had roughly 2,000 satellites thereabouts orbiting the Earth. Yeah.
Space Summit.
Right. So, and now we're a little over 8,000. So by 2030, I don't agree that 250,000, but 3 to 4 times what we have now. So you're looking at 25 to 30 some thousand satellites. So I can write that down and see if I can win that contest. Okay. All right.
General Shaw, since you actually raised the question, which I should have raised with you, when do we start caring about space situational awareness around the moon? Or do we care already?
Well, I think we care a little already, and we will absolutely care a lot when we start sending our astronauts there as part of the Artemis missions. It's not as crowded in the lunar domain as it is in low Earth orbit. Not yet. And the panel there could tell you, well, the astrodynamics operating around the moon are a little bit different. It's not quite as stable, but there will be things in lunar orbit that we're going to need to track that could be threats to astronauts. I need to point out that the Department of Defense has been tracking debris to help human spaceflight from the very, very beginning. Yeah. We were doing that to help NASA, and we've been doing it ever since. We do it today in the International Space Station. Every once in a while, you'll see something in the media, social media, that talks about the NASA maneuvered the International Space Station to avoid a potential collision with debris. They got that notice from the Department of Defense using data that might have been provided by LeoLabs, among others. And so we're all in it together. So I tell you though, once we send astronauts to the moon, we are going to care an awful lot about what is going on there, and we're going to need the capabilities to understand that environment, and that'll be a big inflection point.
Okay, so I'm going to wind us up now with with another question. Apparently, my microphone. I imagine that you've been able to hear me, but apparently my microphone has gone off. We've heard a lot at the meeting about how space is becoming a more and more important part of the economy, and I think we all agree that that's. And I think, whoa. And I think we all agree that that's that's a given. I've also been really struck both in the earlier panel on orbital debris and in this panel at this sense that resiliency is actually growing through the various things you talk about. But now, and we're going to go in reverse order this time, so starting with Rob, which one's getting bigger faster? Are we getting more? So, which is basically the gap between resilience and dependency is to some extent the danger, right? It's if you're becoming more reliant on space infrastructure faster than than that infrastructure is becoming more resilient, then you have a problem. Is resilience growing faster than the importance of the infrastructure, or is the infrastructure outpacing it, and are we still in a position of growing risk? Rob?
I think right now the infrastructure is outpacing the resiliency. When you look at the number of constellations that are going up, both from the commercial and the government side, but I think within the last few years there has been a concerted effort to really start to collaborate of how we can actually create resiliency, and it can occur in a lot of different ways as you heard today.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for Rob, we're playing catch up.
That's right.
Dan.
I think we're playing catch up, but I think there's a tipping point coming, and it's not just by us. I mean, allied by design, right? Allied by design. As we think about our allied nations around the world, Australia's thinking about resiliency, the United Kingdom's thinking about resiliency, and so I think it's going to quickly flip because we realize we're already dependent on space. We're already there. We are dependent on it every single day, whether it's in civilian life or our war fighters that we need to protect. And nations other than the United States, our allies, are also realizing that. So I think there's a tipping point where resiliency will quickly catch up.
I think in space traffic management, I think we're kind of neck and neck. And so there's this big push actually to move space traffic management over to a civilian regulatory function, put it onto commercial assets. And the challenge we have is that every roughly 2 years that goes by, the space traffic doubles. And so what is already a challenging problem, get this new space traffic management system up and running, grows to be twice as hard every 2 years. And so it's, neck and neck. If we do it right, we can keep up. And if there's delay, then we're going to have challenges.
General Shaw.
Yeah, I think you asked a great question, and I guess I agree. We're neck and neck. There's a tension there. I think maybe I'll end by being the optimist, and that is we've drawn attention to this issue, right? We don't ignore debris. We don't ignore practices that aren't sustainable in space. We're talking about it, and that's the beginning. That's what makes me optimistic that we'll do it right. I'll point out, Starlink with thousands of satellites in its orbit, in orbit, at least designed into its constellation, the ability to re-enter those satellites at the end of their lifetime and be responsible and make space sustainable. We need to make sure everything we're doing in space is looking at it from that perspective, because we need to not only keep it helpful to us in the near term, but useful for future generations.
Well, thank you all very much. I think that's been I've been fascinated. I hope everyone else has been, and I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. But that was a really interesting talk. Thank you very much.